The morning mist clung to the Scottish Highlands like a gentle embrace as Catherine adjusted her wool scarf against the crisp autumn air. She gazed out of the car window, watching the familiar landscape of Aberdeenshire roll past in waves of gold and amber. Beside her, William drummed his fingers softly against his knee, a habit she had come to recognize when he was deep in thought about family matters. "He's been looking forward to this for weeks," William said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that had grown between father and son over the years. "You know how much these traditions mean to him, especially now." Catherine nodded, remembering the phone call that had come 3 weeks earlier. King Charles had sounded different somehow, his usual formal tone softened with something that might have been vulnerability. The invitation to Birkhall for the annual autumn gathering wasn't unusual, but this year felt different. This year carried the weight of a crown that had changed everything, even the simple pleasure of a family weekend in Scotland. As their car wound through the estate gates, Catherine caught her first glimpse of Birkhall Castle in months. The stone walls seemed to hold centuries of memories, and she found herself thinking about Queen Elizabeth, who had loved this place so dearly. The gardens that Charles had tended with such care were ablaze with late-blooming roses and the last defiant flowers of the season, as if nature itself was putting on a final show before winter's arrival. William reached over and squeezed her hand as they pulled into the circular drive. "Ready for whatever emotional surprises Papa has planned?" he asked with a gentle smile that didn't quite hide his own uncertainty. They had both learned that Charles, in his grief and newfound responsibility, had become even more sentimental about family gatherings. The heavy wooden door opened before they could knock, and there stood King Charles, dressed not in any royal finery but in a well-worn tweed jacket that Catherine remembered from countless previous visits. His face lit up with genuine joy as he stepped forward to embrace them both, and, for a moment, he looked less like a king and more like a father who had been counting the days until his children came home. "My dear Catherine, William," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he didn't try to hide. "I can't tell you how much this means to me. Come inside. I've had Mrs. MacLeod prepare your favorite rooms, and there's a fire going in the library. I thought we might start with tea and those shortbread biscuits you love so much, Catherine." The warmth of the castle enveloped them as they stepped inside, but it was more than just the physical comfort of the roaring fires and familiar furnishings. There was something in Charles's demeanor that spoke of a man who had found his way back to what mattered most, despite the enormous weight of duty that now rested on his shoulders. As they settled into the comfortable chairs by the library fire, Catherine noticed how Charles's hands shook slightly as he poured the tea, not from age or illness, but from barely contained emotion. This gathering meant something profound to him, something that went beyond tradition or royal protocol. This was about healing, about rebuilding connections that had sometimes been strained by the formal demands of their public lives. "I've been thinking a great deal about legacy lately," Charles said as he handed Catherine her cup, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Not the kind that historians will write about, but the real legacy. The memories we create together, the traditions we pass down, the love we share when no one else is watching." William leaned forward, recognizing the moment for what it was. His father needed to talk, needed to share whatever had been weighing on his heart during the lonely nights at Buckingham Palace. "What's troubling you, Papa?" he asked with the directness that had taken years to develop between them. Charles set down his teacup and looked at both of them with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "I realized that in all the years of duty and protocol, I may have missed too many moments like this. Simple moments. Real moments. Your grandmother understood this, you know. She knew that the crown was important, but family was everything." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she watched this powerful man, this king, reveal his deepest fears and regrets. She had seen Charles in many roles over the years, but this raw honesty was something new, something that the crown had perhaps finally allowed him to express. "When I look at these walls, I see her everywhere," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I hear her laugh in the kitchen when she was helping Mrs. MacLeod with the evening meal. I see her in the garden, deadheading roses with dirt under her fingernails because she insisted on doing it herself. I feel her presence in every corner of this place, and I know that what she wanted most was for us to love each other well." The afternoon light was beginning to fade outside the windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had been there for decades. Catherine realized that this wasn't just a family visit, but a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to the place where emotions could be honest and relationships could breathe without the scrutiny of the world. William stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had played as a child during rare visits when his parents' marriage had still held hope. "I remember building fort walls with those fallen branches near the oak tree," he said softly. "You and Mama would watch from this very window, and, for those moments, we felt like a normal family." Charles joined his son at the window, and Catherine watched as two generations of future kings stood side by side, both carrying the weight of understanding what their roles would cost them, but also what they might gain. "Those were precious times," Charles acknowledged. "I want to make sure we don't lose sight of creating new precious times, even now, especially now." As evening approached, Mrs. McLeod announced that dinner was ready in the small dining room, the one that Charles preferred for family gatherings because it felt intimate rather than grand. As they made their way through the familiar corridors, Catherine noticed how Charles paused at various photographs and mementos, each one seeming to tell a story that he wasn't quite ready to share but needed to remember. The dinner table was set with the everyday china, not the formal royal setting, and Catherine appreciated this choice more than Charles might ever know. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing like wine, covering topics from William's latest conservation projects to Catherine's work with early childhood development. But underneath it all was the unspoken understanding that this gathering was about more than catching up. As they finished their meal, Charles raised his glass of wine and looked at both of them with eyes that held decades of love, loss, and hope. "To tradition," he said simply. "And to the family that makes all traditions meaningful." They clinked glasses as the candles flickered in the gentle draft from the old windows, and Catherine felt something settle in her heart that she hadn't realized had been unsettled. This was what Charles had needed, what they all had needed, this return to the simple truth that beneath all the titles and responsibilities, they were just people who loved each other and wanted to honor the memory of someone who had loved them all. The evening ended with them sitting by the dying fire, each lost in their own thoughts but comfortable in the shared silence that only family can truly enjoy. Tomorrow would bring new conversations and deeper revelations, but tonight was perfect in its gentle simplicity, a foundation upon which the rest of their time together could be built. Dawn broke over Birkhall with the kind of ethereal beauty that made Catherine understand why the Scottish Highlands had captured so many hearts over the centuries. She woke to the sound of birds calling across the mist-covered moors and the distant bleating of sheep in the fields beyond the castle grounds. William was still sleeping peacefully beside her, his face relaxed in a way that only came when he was truly away from the pressures of royal duties. Wrapping herself in the thick tartan robe that had been laid out for her, Catherine made her way to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The view took her breath away, as it always did. Rolling hills stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed to hold every shade of gray and blue imaginable. In the garden below, she could see a figure moving among the rose bushes, and her heart warmed as she recognized Charles, already up and tending to his beloved plants despite the early hour. By the time she and William had dressed and made their way downstairs, the smell of traditional Scottish breakfast was filling the castle corridors. Mrs. McLeod, who had been caring for Birkhall for more than 2 decades, greeted them with the kind of warm smile that made Catherine feel like she was coming home to family rather than visiting a royal residence. "His Majesty has been up since 5, Mrs. McLeod informed them with a knowing look. "In the garden, as usual. He says the roses need special attention before the first frost, but between you and me, I think he just finds peace out there with his thoughts and memories." Catherine exchanged a look with William. They both understood that Charles's early morning garden rituals were about more than horticulture. Since becoming king, he had struggled to find moments of genuine solitude, and these pre-dawn hours among the flowers had become his meditation, his prayer, his way of connecting with something larger than the enormous responsibilities that now defined his days. They found him in the kitchen garden, his hands deep in the soil around a particularly stubborn rosebush that seemed determined to bloom despite the approaching winter. His face was streaked with dirt, his expensive clothes forgotten in favor of practical gardening gear, and Catherine thought she had never seen him look more content or more like himself. "Papa," William called softly, not wanting to startle him from whatever peaceful reverie he had found among the plants. "The roses are lucky to have such devoted attention." Charles looked up with a smile that transformed his entire face. "They remind me of her, you know," he said simply, and they all knew he meant Queen Elizabeth. She planted most of these varieties herself over the years. This particular bush was her favorite. She always said it bloomed longer than any rose had a right to, stubborn and beautiful until the very end. Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched Charles gently stroke the petals of a late-blooming rose, his touch reverent and careful. "She would be so proud to see you carrying on her traditions," she said softly, meaning every word. "Would she?" Charles asked, and, for a moment, the king disappeared entirely, leaving only a son who still missed his mother desperately. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing any of this the right way. The crown feels so heavy some mornings, and I find myself wishing I could ask her advice about the simplest decisions." William knelt beside his father in the dirt, his own expensive clothing forgotten as he reached for a pair of pruning shears. "She raised you to be exactly the king you are," he said with quiet conviction. "Trust in that. Trust in the love she gave you and the wisdom she shared, even when you didn't realize you were learning." For the next hour, they worked together in comfortable companionship, 3 generations connected by soil and shared purpose. Catherine found herself assigned to deadheading the spent blooms, a task that Queen Elizabeth had apparently loved because it encouraged new growth even as the season was ending. There was something deeply symbolic about the work, something that spoke to renewal and hope even in the face of inevitable change. As they worked, Charles began to share memories that he had apparently been holding close to his heart. "She used to say that gardens taught you everything you needed to know about life," he said, carefully wrapping a delicate climbing rose for winter protection. "Patience, because nothing blooms before its time. Faith, because you plant seeds not knowing what challenges they'll face. Love, because the most beautiful flowers grow from the deepest roots. And stubbornness," William added with a grin, wrestling with a particularly thorny branch. "Some of these roses are as determined as she was." The laughter that followed was rich and healing, echoing across the garden in a way that seemed to awaken the very stones of the castle. Catherine watched father and son working side by side and felt privileged to witness this moment of genuine connection, this bridge between grief and acceptance that Charles had been building one careful step at a time. When they finally made their way back to the castle for breakfast, their hands were dirty and their clothes were stained, but their hearts felt lighter. Mrs. MacLeod took one look at them and burst into the kind of laughter that comes from years of watching the same patterns repeat themselves. "You look exactly like your grandmother did after her morning garden rounds," she told William. "Absolutely filthy and absolutely radiant." The breakfast that followed was a feast of traditional Scottish fare that Mrs. MacLeod had clearly spent hours preparing. There were fresh eggs from the castle's own chickens, thick-cut bacon that had been cured locally, oatcakes that melted in their mouths, and honey that came from the beehives Charles had installed in the meadow beyond the formal gardens. But, more than the food, it was the conversation that nourished them. Charles spoke about his plans for the estate, his hopes for expanding the organic farming practices that he had been pioneering for decades, his dreams of making Birkhall a model for sustainable living that could inspire others. William shared stories about his children's latest adventures, their questions about their grandfather the king, their innocent wonder at the responsibilities that would someday be theirs. Catherine found herself drawn into discussions about education and childhood development, topics that had become her passion over the years. Charles listened with the intensity of a man who understood that the future of the monarchy depended not just on tradition but on adaptation, on understanding how to raise children who could be both royal and real, both dutiful and authentic. "The children ask about you constantly," Catherine told Charles as she buttered another oatcake. "George wants to know if being king means you get to make all the rules, and Charlotte insists that you must have the most beautiful crown in the world. Louis just wants to know if you have a horse." "Do I have a horse?" Charles asked with mock seriousness. "What did you tell him?" "That grandpapa has something even better than a horse," William replied. "He has stories, and gardens, and a castle where roses bloom until Christmas because they're too polite to stop." The afternoon brought unexpected rain, the kind of gentle Scottish shower that seems to last forever without ever becoming truly heavy. They moved their activities indoors, and Charles led them to a room that Catherine had never seen before, a small study that he called his private sanctuary. The walls were lined with books about everything from organic farming to philosophy, and every surface was covered with photographs that told the story of a life lived fully despite its many challenges. There were pictures of Charles as a young man, impossibly young and serious in military uniform. There were photographs of him with Diana, both of them glowing with the hope of early marriage. There were countless images of William and Harry as children, their faces bright with mischief and joy. And, everywhere, there were pictures of Queen Elizabeth, not in her official capacity but as a mother, grandmother, and friend. "This is where I come when I need to remember who I am beneath the crown," Charles explained as he settled into a worn leather chair that had clearly been his favorite for years. "These walls hold my real life, the one that exists between public appearances and state duties." Catherine studied a particular photograph that showed Charles and Queen Elizabeth working together in this very garden, both of them covered in dirt and laughing at some shared joke. "She looks so happy here," Catherine observed. "So free." She was, Charles agreed. This place gave her permission to be herself in ways that nowhere else could. "I hope it does the same for all of us, for generations to come." As the rain continued to fall softly against the windows, they spent the afternoon sharing stories and memories, each one adding another layer to the emotional foundation they were building together. William spoke about his fears for his children, his hopes for their happiness, his determination to give them as much normalcy as possible while still preparing them for their future roles. Catherine found herself opening up about her own childhood, her working-class roots, the culture shock of entering royal life, and how much she had learned from watching Queen Elizabeth navigate the impossible balance between duty and family. "She taught me that you can be royal and real at the same time," Catherine said. "That authenticity isn't the enemy of duty, but its foundation." Charles listened to these revelations with the attention of a man who understood how difficult it was to find your place in a world that demanded perfection while forgetting that perfection was inhuman. "You've brought something precious to this family," he told Catherine with deep sincerity. "Your groundedness, your genuine warmth, your ability to see the person behind the title. William is lucky to have you, but so are we all." The evening meal was quieter than the night before, each of them processing the emotional intensity of the day in their own way. But there was a sense of progress, of walls coming down and hearts opening up in ways that might not have been possible anywhere else but in this special place that held so many memories and so much love. As they prepared to retire for the night, Charles stopped them in the hallway outside their rooms. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that made Catherine curious. "Tomorrow I want to show you something special, something I've been planning for months. It's my way of ensuring that the traditions continue, that the love continues, that the memory of your grandmother lives on in tangible ways." With that mysterious promise, they parted for the night, each carrying the warmth of the day with them into their dreams, each grateful for the gift of time and space to simply be family together. The third morning at Birkhall dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that made the Scottish landscape look like something from a fairy tale. Catherine woke to find William already dressed and standing by the window, his expression thoughtful as he watched his father once again working in the garden below. "He's different here," William said softly as Catherine joined him at the window. "More like the man I remember from childhood, before everything became so complicated. Sometimes I think this place saves him from himself." Catherine wrapped her arms around her husband's waist and rested her chin on his shoulder, watching as Charles moved with purpose among the flower beds. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Mrs. MacLeod was with him, along with two groundskeepers who seemed to be working on some sort of installation near the old oak tree where William had built his childhood forts. "What do you think they're doing?" Catherine asked, curiosity evident in her voice. "With Papa, it could be anything," William replied with a mixture of fondness and exasperation. "He's been mysterious about his plans for today ever since we arrived. You know how he gets when he has a project that means something to him." When they made their way downstairs for breakfast, they found Charles already seated at the table, his eyes bright with anticipation and what looked suspiciously like barely contained excitement. He was clean and freshly dressed, having obviously finished his morning garden work earlier than usual. "Good morning, my dears," he greeted them with an enthusiasm that was infectious. "I hope you're prepared for something special today. I've been working on a surprise that I think will mean a great deal to all of us, especially when the children are old enough to appreciate it." Mrs. MacLeod served them a breakfast of fresh salmon and scrambled eggs, but Charles was clearly too excited to focus much on eating. He kept glancing out the window toward the garden, checking his watch, and fidgeting with his napkin in a way that reminded Catherine of a child waiting for Christmas morning. Papa, William said finally, laughing at his father's obvious impatience. Whatever you've planned, we're ready. You're practically vibrating with excitement. Charles stood up abruptly, his breakfast only half finished. Come then, he said, extending his hands to both of them. I can't wait any longer. This has been months in the planning, and I need to share it with you now, while we're all here together, while the moment feels right. They followed him through the castle and out into the garden, where Catherine immediately noticed that the area near the old oak tree had been transformed overnight. What had been a simple grassy space the day before was now home to an elegant stone bench surrounded by newly planted rose bushes. But it was the brass plaque mounted on the back of the bench that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. She moved closer to read the inscription, her eyes filling with tears as the words became clear, in memory of Queen Elizabeth II, who found her greatest joy in family gatherings at Birkhall. This garden bench is dedicated to the love she shared, the wisdom she offered, and the traditions she preserved. May all who sit here remember that the most important crown anyone can wear is the love of family. Below the main inscription, in smaller script, were the words, planted with love by her son Charles, and tended with care by all who follow. William stood beside Catherine, his own eyes moist as he read the dedication. The rose bushes surrounding the bench were clearly young plantings, but Charles had chosen varieties that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season, ensuring that there would always be flowers to honor his mother's memory. I wanted to create something permanent, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. Something that would outlive all of us, something that would remind future generations that this place was special to her, that family was everything to her. The roses are all varieties that she loved, planted so that there will be blooms from spring until the first snow. Catherine reached for Charles's hand, squeezing it gently as she struggled to find words adequate for the moment. It's perfect, she finally managed. She would have loved knowing that her great-grandchildren will play in this garden, that they'll sit on this bench and hear stories about the grandmother who loved them before they were born. William walked around the memorial garden, examining each rose bush with the care of someone who understood the thought that had gone into every choice. These are the same varieties from the formal gardens at Windsor, he observed. You brought a piece of her favorite place to her sanctuary here. I did, Charles confirmed. And there's more. He led them to a small shed near the garden that Catherine had never paid much attention to before. Inside, she was amazed to find a complete collection of gardening tools, each one carefully labeled and organized, along with detailed notebooks filled with what appeared to be decades of gardening observations in Queen Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting. She kept meticulous records, Charles explained, handling one of the notebooks with reverent care. Every plant, every bloom, every success and failure. She documented it all because she said gardens were history books written in flowers and leaves. I thought perhaps the children might like to continue her tradition when they're older. Catherine picked up one of the notebooks and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with observations written in the Queen's precise script, notes about which varieties thrived in Scottish soil, sketches of garden layouts, even pressed flowers that had been carefully preserved between the pages. It was like holding a tangible piece of the Queen's inner life, her private passion that had brought her such joy. Look at this, William said, pointing to an entry dated just 2 years ago. She was still planning new plantings, still dreaming about future gardens. Even at her age, she was thinking about legacy, about what would grow and flourish long after she was gone. They spent the morning exploring the garden with new eyes, seeing it not just as a beautiful space but as a living memorial to a woman who had shaped their lives in countless ways. Charles showed them areas where he planned to add new features, a small greenhouse where the children could learn to grow their own plants, a herb garden that would supply the kitchen with fresh ingredients, walking paths that would allow elderly visitors to enjoy the space without difficulty. I want this to be a place where the family comes for generations, Charles said as they sat together on the new memorial bench. Not just for formal occasions, but for real moments. I want George and Charlotte and Louis to bring their own children here someday, to sit on this bench and tell them about their great-great-grandmother who believed that love was the only thing that really mattered. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Princess Anne, who arrived unannounced in her characteristic no-nonsense manner. Catherine watched with amusement as Charles's sister surveyed the memorial garden with her typical directness, walking around the bench and examining the roses with a critical eye. Well, Anne said finally, her voice gruff with barely concealed emotion. She would have approved. Though she probably would have suggested a different variety of rose for the north corner. You know how particular she was about plant placement. The siblings' laughter broke some of the emotional tension that had been building throughout the morning, and Catherine was grateful for Anne's practical perspective. Sometimes the best way to honor grief was with humor, with the kind of loving criticism that only family could offer. Anne joined them for lunch, and the conversation took on a livelier tone as she shared her own memories of their mother's gardening obsessions. She once spent an entire summer rearranging the rose garden at Balmoral because she decided the color combinations weren't harmonious, and recalled. The groundskeepers thought she had lost her mind, but the result was absolutely spectacular. She had very strong opinions about everything, Charles added with a fond smile. Including how we should live our lives, raise our children, and fulfill our duties. But it all came from love, even when it didn't feel that way at the time. Catherine listened to the siblings share stories and realized she was witnessing something precious, two people who had grown up under incredible pressure, learning to see their mother not as an icon but as a woman who had loved them imperfectly but completely. Their grief was real, but so was their gratitude for the foundation she had given them. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves naturally gravitating back to the memorial garden. Anne surprised everyone by kneeling down and beginning to work the soil around one of the newly planted rose bushes, her movements expert and sure. She taught me to do this when I was barely old enough to hold a trowel, and explained, not looking up from her work. Said that if you were going to have gardens, you needed to understand them from the ground up. No delegating the real work to other people. Soon all four of them were working together, weeding and watering and adjusting the soil around the memorial roses. It felt like a ritual, a way of connecting with Queen Elizabeth through the work she had loved, the earth she had tended with her own hands despite having staff who could have done it for her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Charles stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I found this among her things at Balmoral, and I think she would want it to have a special place here." He opened the box to reveal a simple silver locket, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside was a tiny photograph of Birkhall taken many years ago, showing the castle in summer with the gardens in full bloom. "She carried this with her everywhere," Charles said softly. "Even to state dinners and official functions. It was her way of keeping this place close to her heart no matter where duty took her." Without ceremony, he hung the locket from a small hook that had been discreetly installed on the memorial bench, where it would catch the morning light and remind anyone who sat there that love was portable, that home could be carried in your heart no matter how far you traveled. As darkness began to fall and they made their way back to the castle, Catherine felt that something fundamental had shifted during their time at Birkhall. This wasn't just a memorial to Queen Elizabeth, but a renewal of the bonds that held the family together, a recommitment to the values she had tried to instill in all of them. The evening meal was quieter than previous nights, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the day's revelations and emotions. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes when people have shared something meaningful and don't need words to understand each other. As they prepared for bed, William turned to Catherine with an expression of wonder that made her heart flutter. "Did you feel it today?" he asked. "The sense that she was with us, that she approved of what Papa had created?" Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I think she would be proud of all of us," she said. "Proud of your father for honoring her memory so beautifully, proud of us for being here to support him, proud that the love she gave is still growing and flourishing in new ways." Tomorrow would bring their final morning at Birkhall, but Catherine knew that the memories they had created over these 3 days would last a lifetime. More importantly, she understood that they had helped Charles find a way to channel his grief into something beautiful and lasting, something that would comfort future generations and keep Queen Elizabeth's love alive in tangible ways. The final morning at Birkhall arrived with a gentle Scottish rain that seemed to mirror the bittersweet emotions of departure. Catherine woke early, drawn by an impulse she couldn't quite name to spend a few quiet moments alone in the memorial garden before the day's farewells began. She wrapped herself in her warmest coat and made her way outside, not caring that the drizzle immediately dampened her hair and cheeks. The garden looked different in the soft gray light, more ethereal somehow, as if the rain had washed away the boundaries between memory and reality. Catherine sat on the memorial bench, running her fingers over the brass plaque that honored Queen Elizabeth's legacy, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This place would endure, these roses would bloom season after season, and the love that had created this sanctuary would outlive them all. She was surprised when Charles appeared beside her, offering a steaming cup of tea and settling onto the bench without comment about the weather. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the rain bead on the rose petals and listening to the distant sound of birds greeting the morning despite the gray skies. "I used to worry that I had failed her," Charles said eventually, his voice so quiet that Catherine had to lean closer to hear him above the gentle patter of rain. "All those years of disagreement, all the times I chose my own path instead of following her guidance. I worried that history would remember me as the son who disappointed the great Queen Elizabeth." Catherine turned to study his profile, seeing the vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "And now," she asked gently. "Now I understand that she never wanted me to be her copy," Charles replied, his eyes fixed on the memorial plaque. "She wanted me to be worthy of the crown in my own way, to find my own path to service and purpose. This garden, this weekend with you and William, these moments of real connection. I think she would say I'm finally learning what she was trying to teach me all along." The sound of footsteps on the gravel path announced William's arrival, and he joined them on the bench despite the rain that was now falling more steadily. "Mrs. MacLeod is convinced we've all lost our minds, sitting out here in the weather," he said with a grin. "She's threatening to send out umbrellas and hot water bottles." "Let her fuss," Charles replied with affection. "These are the moments that matter. Not the state dinners or the formal photographs, but sitting together in the rain, talking about things that really count. Your grandmother understood that royal life could steal your soul if you weren't careful to protect what was genuine and real." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. MacLeod appeared with a large umbrella and expressions of maternal concern that made them all laugh. "Your Majesty," she scolded gently, "you'll catch your death sitting out here like a romantic poet. The children need their grandfather to stay healthy, you know." They allowed themselves to be shepherded back into the castle, where Mrs. MacLeod had prepared a farewell breakfast that was clearly intended to sustain them on their emotional journey back to their regular lives. The table was laden with their favorite foods from the weekend: fresh eggs, thick-cut bacon, homemade preserves, and the shortbread cookies that had become Catherine's particular weakness. But, more than the food, it was the conversation that nourished them. They talked about plans for Christmas, about bringing the children to Birkhall in the spring when the memorial roses would be showing their first blooms, about the traditions they wanted to establish and the memories they hoped to create in this special place. "I want George to learn to garden here," William said thoughtfully. "Not because he has to, but because he wants to. I want him to understand that kings can have dirty fingernails and genuine passions, that duty doesn't mean sacrificing everything that makes you human. And, Charlotte," Catherine added with a smile. "She would love having her own section of the garden to tend. She has such strong opinions about everything already, I can imagine her redesigning the entire estate by the time she's 10. Charles laughed at the image, but his expression grew serious as he considered the implications of their words. "I want all of them to know that this place exists for them, not as a burden but as a refuge. When the weight of expectation becomes too heavy, when the public eye feels too intense, they'll always have Birkhall as a sanctuary." The time came too soon to pack their bags and prepare for departure. Catherine found herself moving slowly through the castle rooms, trying to memorize details that would help her carry the peace of this place with her back to their demanding public life. The way afternoon light filtered through the library windows, the comfortable creak of ancient floorboards, the lingering scent of roses and wood smoke that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Charles insisted on carrying their bags to the car himself, waving away the offers of help from the staff. It was a small gesture, but Catherine understood its significance. He needed to be the one to see them off, to complete the circle of hospitality that had begun when he welcomed them with such joy 3 days ago. As they stood beside their car for final farewells, Charles suddenly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "For the children," he said, pressing it into Catherine's hands. "A little piece of Birkhall to take home with them." Catherine unwrapped the package carefully and found 3 small pots, each containing a young rose cutting from the memorial garden. Attached to each pot was a handwritten note in Charles's careful script, "For George, Charlotte, and Louis, with all my love. Plant these in your garden at home and think of your great-grandmother, who believed that love grows more beautiful with time." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Catherine's eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that come from being deeply understood and cherished. "They'll treasure these," she said, embracing Charles warmly. "And every time the roses bloom, they'll remember this weekend and the grandfather who taught them that tradition is just another word for love passed down through generations." William's farewell with his father was longer and more emotional, the two men embracing with an openness that spoke of walls finally broken down and understanding finally achieved. "Thank you," William said simply, "for sharing your grief, for including us in your healing, for showing us that it's possible to honor the past while building something new for the future." "Thank you," Charles replied, his voice thick with emotion, "for being patient with an old man who was still learning how to balance being a king with being a father and grandfather. These days have meant more to me than you'll ever know." As their car pulled away from Birkhall, Catherine watched Charles through the rear window, standing alone in front of the castle with Mrs. MacLeod beside him. He raised his hand in farewell, and she could see even from a distance that he was crying, but they looked like tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. The drive back to London was quieter than their journey north, both Catherine and William lost in their own reflections about the profound changes that had taken place over their 3 days in Scotland. The memorial garden had been beautiful and meaningful, but the real transformation had been in Charles himself, in his willingness to open his heart and share his deepest fears and hopes with them. "He's going to be all right," William said suddenly, as they passed through the rolling hills of northern England. "For the first time since he became king, I really believe he's going to find his way to happiness in this role." Catherine nodded, thinking about the man they had left behind at Birkhall, already planning new gardens and dreaming of future family gatherings. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. "Not just of the memorial, but of the man he's becoming, the king he's learning to be." When they finally arrived home, they found their children waiting eagerly to hear about their adventure with Grandpapa. George wanted to know if there were really sheep in Scotland, Charlotte demanded details about the castle's secret passages, and Louis asked if Grandpapa had missed them as much as they had missed him. Catherine and William exchanged glances as they shared carefully edited stories about their weekend, each of them knowing that the real gift they had received at Birkhall wasn't something that could be easily explained to children. It was the understanding that family love could heal even the deepest wounds, that traditions were only meaningful when they carried genuine emotion, and that the crown was not a burden but an opportunity to serve something larger than yourself. That evening, as they tucked their children into bed, Catherine found herself thinking about the rose cuttings that Charles had given them. Tomorrow, she would help the children plant them in their garden at home, and she would tell them stories about their great-grandmother who had loved roses and family gatherings and the simple pleasure of getting her hands dirty in good soil. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the weekend that had brought them all closer together, for the king who had learned to be vulnerable, for the husband who had found new appreciation for his father, and for the children who would grow up knowing that love was the foundation of every tradition worth preserving. The rain that had followed them from Scotland continued to fall gently against their windows, and Catherine fell asleep thinking about memorial gardens and family bonds, about the roses that would bloom next spring and the stories that would be told for generations to come about the weekend when King Charles opened his heart and invited them all to heal together. In her dreams, she saw Queen Elizabeth sitting on the memorial bench, smiling as she watched her great-grandchildren play among the roses, satisfied that the love she had planted in her own lifetime was still growing, still flourishing, still creating beauty in a world that often seemed too harsh for such tender things. The Birkhall tradition would continue, but now it carried new meaning, deeper purpose, and the absolute certainty that some bonds are strong enough to transcend even death, linking past and future in an endless chain of love that no crown could make more precious than it already was.